important moment in American-Russian relations, especially post-Ukraine invasion, as women's basketball legend Brittney Griner heads home after her 9-month detention in Russia. She was arrested in February, 1 week before the invasion, on drug possession charges and was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment in August, which her defense and the US deemed politically motivated. There had been talk that there would be a prisoner swap involving the release of Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout, nicknamed the Merchant of Death. Griner, along with former Marine Paul Whelan and American-born teacher Mark Fogel, who were imprisoned for 16 and 14 years respectively, were said to have been involved in the swap. But in the end, only Griner made it out of Russia. Many in the US claim it was because of her celebrity status or for political reasons due to her race, gender, and sexual orientation. But why was it only her who was freed and not the two who were imprisoned for longer? Who got the better deal, the US or Russia? Should governments negotiate prison swaps, especially with prisoners who may cause them harm in the long term? Should the Griner-Bout prisoner swap have taken place?
So let's get to it, dear gentlemen. Should the Griner-Bout prisoner swap have taken place to begin with? As always, we begin with this quick fire round of 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and then we engage in the conversation. Mr. Bergman, please take the lead.
Yeah, first of all, I would say yes, absolutely. This needed to happen. It's not savory. We don't like the details of it, but it had to happen. The President of the United States, when it comes to wrongful detentions and political prisoners, has 3 main responsibilities. The first one is to bring the victims back home, bring innocent Americans back home. The second one is to find and deploy policies that will mitigate the risk of taking more Americans, deterrence policies or others. And 3 is to take care of the families and the prisoners through the ordeal and after. Now, what's important is to remember that the efforts to deter cannot be on the back of those who have already been taken.
And we will, of course, expand on that point exactly in a split second. But for now, Mr. David Katz, your take?
No, absolutely disgusting, despicable, and completely wrong from every single angle possible. Let's look at who we released. And if you ask who got the better deal, this is not a negotiation. The Russians knew exactly what they were doing, and they needed Bout. Bout is an arms dealer. Bout was arrested by DEA, and what was he arrested for? For the plan to sell 800 surface-to-air missiles, 30,000 AK-47 rifles, 10 million rounds of ammunition, plus grenades, unarmed, unmanned aerial vehicles. That's why the Russians let him go. And what's going to happen now? Ukrainians are going to pay the price. That's why. I'm very happy that Ms. Griner's out. She's a fellow American. Yeah. I'm delighted she's home, but not at that cost.
Okay, and before we dive into the debate, which I'm already certain is going to be interesting, Mr. Yoav Borowitz, your take?
Well, Ellie, I am in between. I think definitely I don't like this deal whatsoever, but I think President Biden didn't have a lot of, options here. He had to release Brittney Griner. I think the U.S. should have also released Whelan and Vogel. This deal is better for the Russians than for the Americans, no doubt about it, but I think there were not many options here, therefore the deal happened.
Okay, and on that note, gentlemen, please feel free to interact from this point onwards, and let me begin by asking what Mr. Katz alluded to. Was no deal better than this deal, Mr. Bergman?
I don't think that a no deal was better than this deal. Again, I understand Mr. Katz's strong opinion on this. It makes sense. I don't like it. I don't like that we need to release criminals for it. I also understand from the background, law enforcement agents, their whole career, the Department of Justice, their job is to find those criminals, put them in trial, and put them in jail. They're not in the business of getting people out of jail.
Yeah.
But that's why the power of pardon is not in the not in the hands of the Attorney General of the United States. It's in the hands of the President. His view is more strategic. His responsibilities are larger than that, and I think that's why the perspective is quite different here.
Mr. Katz, would you have preferred to see no deal at all at this point in time?
Absolutely. Look, I have no animus. Like I said, I'm delighted she is home. But you have to understand, it's not that law enforcement are not in the business of getting people out of jail. Law enforcement is in the business of locking up people who are harming others. Bout has the blood of, this is not hyperbole, he's got the blood of thousands. And why did Putin let him out? Because he wanted to enter a new era of Russian-American relations? No. What is Russia doing right now? They're scrambling for arms. How do we know that? Where are they going? They're going to Iran to purchase missiles, to purchase unmanned aerial vehicles. What exactly can Bout provide to the Putin regime? That's why he's out. And what's the price? Your preceding story talked about more strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure by unmanned vehicles. Guess what? You're going to look for a lot more of those now that Bout is out.
Well, Yoav, before I get back to you, Mr. Bergman, as mentioned, you were a pivotal part of these negotiations. And after 5 years of efforts on your end, at the very final stretch, when did you realize Paul Whelan and Mark Fogel were out of the deal? And if you were to advise to President Biden, should it have been a go or no go?
So first of all, you mentioned Paul Whelan and Mark Fogel. There are actually other Americans there that are not named yet that are in prison. And negotiations are very complicated, and they go throughout. We do not work for the U.S. government. We work on behalf of the families. We do not work on behalf of Mark Fogel's family. We have 3 other families in addition to Paul Whelan. We, in all of our contacts, we're not part of the formal negotiations. We're informal, which allows us a little bit more flexibility in talking to the Russians. I was in Moscow twice for this. I've met with the Russians outside of Moscow several times in the last few months. And we provide the information that we have and all the different discussions and insights that we have to the White House. At the end of the day, it's the president's decision. The official channel does it. I can tell you in all of our conversations, we have focused on getting Paul Whelan out as well as Brittney Griner. I believe that the administration, I'm not inside their conversations, concluded that at this point, Putin was not willing to give Paul Whelan out. There's a bunch of reasons that we can talk about, and they had to make a choice. Are they holding Brittney Griner behind for that, or are they going? In other words, is it Brittney Griner coming home or nobody coming home at this point? If somebody who works with the family, somebody who actually can employ empathy to the families and the suffering that they're having, there are 50 Americans that are held around the world, they need to come back home.
And Yoav Borowitz, you've mentioned it in your opening remarks. What do you think is a greater, quote-unquote, win for Moscow? The Merchant of Death being released, or the fact that Whelan was kept in? Or in other words, making gains or causing losses?
I think they made gains on both fronts. First of all, getting back Victor Bout, the Merchant of Death, and also not getting out Whelan and Vogel and others. So they just let Brittney Griner out, but she's a big fish. Brittney Griner is a big name. She's the biggest name of them all, and that's why also in the U.S., she's a very, very famous basketball player, and we know she was put in prison for basically nothing. She was detained for 9 months, and she was supposed to be in Russian prison now for the next 9 years. So the U.S. really had no options here other than doing this deal. But this is really, it's a rotten deal, no doubt about it.
And in this respect, Mr. Katz, Republican backlash wasn't late in coming. Not just Republican, but their rhetoric was a bit fiercer, to say the least, blaming Biden essentially for picking Griner for PR reasons. Is national security being politicized on both sides of the political aisle, that is?
Let's be very, very clear. There is no justification. Again, I have nothing but good feelings that she's home. I lament that we have other American citizens in Russian jails. You can't. We all know the biblical reference. Who says your blood is redder?
Yeah.
There are people who are going to die because this guy's out. And by the way, if you want to know why Griner was the only one released because it was one last chance for Putin to stick the thumb in the eye of Joe Biden, because he knows he's politically weak and he knows he had no choice here, at least for his base, because Brittney Griner has celebrity. She strikes the right demographic. But why should her celebrity status put her at the front of the line with people who have been in jail longer? It's disgusting. And more importantly, people are going to suffer the price, including Americans.
Can I jump in?
Of course, Mr. Bergman, of course.
Mr. Katz, you're making a bunch of assumptions here that are actually incorrect about the reason why she's out and Paul Whelan is still in. There's no doubt that Vladimir Putin prefers to punish his enemies than to help his friends, and that's what he's doing here. Objective is to punish Joe Biden, but denying the fact that he had the leverage over this is not going to make it go away. As for Victor Bout, again, there's no love for anybody like that. But seriously, take a step back for a second. The guy spent 14 years in American jails. Do you think that the agencies that you are a part of and the work that the Department of Justice and all of its agencies in the United States are now going to be in a position where this guy, 14 years in American jail, is going to come up, reestablish his network, and immediately starts impacting Ukraine? I believe better in the U.S.
Absolutely, yes.
That's my sense, including.
You have to understand. Vladimir Putin does nothing that is not calculated. He knows exactly what Bout's capable of. He's going to be supplying arms for Russia immediately. Yes, the answer to your question is yes.
And
Russia doesn't have enough arms without Victor Bout, who's in jail for 14 years. The superpower Russia doesn't have enough arms. Right. They need this guy to get arms.
Right. Yes. You know how I know that? Who are they scrounging arms from now? They're scrounging arms from the Iranians. Why would they do that if they're the superpower? Shouldn't they be supplying Iran with arms? No. You know why? Because the Russians are a corrupt, hollow military.
But they have a humongous military. They're still a superpower. They don't need one guy, definitely not a guy sitting in jail for almost 15 years to reestablish their strength. It doesn't seem realistic.
You base this, well, let me ask you this question. Then why then do they have to go to a third-rate power, Iran, for supplies? Answer that question if you can.
In 5 seconds, Yoav Borowitz, before we take a break.
Yeah, I think they go wherever they can go, but Russia is still one of the strongest countries in the world, still, and I don't think they need this one guy for their strength.
And perhaps President Putin's objective here was more to hurt the enemy rather to gain himself. Break, and we're back. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Mr. David Katz from Woodlands, Texas, CEO of Global Security Group and former federal agent from Virginia, Mr. Mickey Bergman, Vice President and Executive Director at the Richardson Center for Global Engagement, and here in our Tel Aviv studios, Yoav Borowitz, Head of Sports at DKAN, the Israeli Public Broadcasting Corporation. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, but before we get back to the discussion, let's take a listen to the American and Russian leaders, both hailing their own alleged success and the alleged failure of the other. Take a listen.
We never forgot about Brittney. We've not forgotten about Paul Whelan, who's been unjustly detained in Russia for years. This was not a choice of which American to bring home. We brought home Trevor Reed when we had a chance earlier this year. Sadly, for totally illegitimate reasons, Russia is treating Paul's case differently than Brittney's. And while we have not yet succeeded in securing Paul's release, we are not giving up. We will never give up.
Are other exchanges possible? Yes, everything is possible. This is the result of negotiations and the search for compromises. In this case, the compromises were found. We do not refuse to continue this work in the future.
So let's once again, gentlemen, engage in a quick fire round of 30 seconds each to the more fundamental question, perhaps. Should governments negotiate prison swaps, generally speaking? Mr. Katz, please take the lead.
Yeah, well, the State Department does that. They make deals like this all the time. But the question is, they have to be commensurate and in the interest ultimately of national security. If you look at Russia, Putin fancies himself like Stalin. What did Stalin do when his own son was captured? Refused to trade him for a German general. Why? Because he said, I don't trade a marshal for a lieutenant. In this case, who got the marshal? Who got the lieutenant? Vladimir Putin got his marshal back.
Yoav, Borowitz, your thoughts?
I think government should do prisoner swaps. Of course, it's not the best thing, but we're talking real politic here, and there's no other options. And even Israel does it for years and years. We also say for years we won't negotiate with terrorists, but sometimes when we have to, we do negotiate with terrorists. So those things, I agree with Mr. Katz, they happen all the time.
Last but definitely not least, Mr. Bergman, your take?
I agree. I think that those things happen a lot. They happen with Democratic and Republican presidents in the United States. It's just the way it is. I think our policy of no concession needs to be amended to figure out it's not our policy to make concessions. That's what it needs to be. But again, some cases need to be dealt like that. Not all of them. We have brought back an American prisoner from Burma earlier last year, and there was no concession involved. It's case by case.
And on that note, let's please feel free to engage in the conversation. And now, in echoing what Mr. Borowitz just said, does that qualify as a breach of the policy of no negotiations with terrorists to an extent, Mr. Bergman?
I don't think it does. Again, I think the policy itself has been stated. There's been a lot of criticism of that policy or evaluation of it. I like to go to data. Brian Jenkins, who's one of the fathers of counterterrorism in the United States, did a study with Rand Corporation, actually the only data that is out there on this, and concluded that one of the reasons said behind the no concession policy is because it will incentivize the taking of more Americans or making Americans more vulnerable. The data does not support that. The data shows no correlation between the way that these deals are resolved and the actual number of cases that follow them. What it does suggest is that when they're not negotiated, then the prisoners in likelihood do not come back safe.
But in this respect, Mr. Katz, as counterintuitive or perhaps not supported by data as it may sound, but if Iranians are watching this deal, or the Kremlin, keeping tabs on the fallout, etc., is it to an extent, or such deal to an extent, encourage political imprisonments?
There is no possible answer other than yes, especially now during this particular period in history when this country is so divided. We have a president who quite frankly is not up to the task. You have a situation now where all it takes is grabbing someone with either celebrity or the potential to have their cause celebrated, and it will help if they are of a particular demographic. And that is going to happen. And you watch and see, and then we'll have a new set of data.
Mr. Bergman, I admit that my phrasing of the question somewhat invited one type of an answer, but I can see you're smiling, so please chime in.
No, I'm smiling because I like that we can make those statements even though data suggests exactly the opposite. And this is not about getting new data. This has been going on for a long, long time. This is not new. Are the Iranians watching in it? Are the Venezuelans? Look, there are four repeat offenders that skew the numbers here. It's Russia, China, Iran, and Venezuela. If you take out the prisoners that are held by them, we're back to about 20 or 15 Americans held. That's where we said, are they watching it? Is this new for them? No. Venezuela has started collecting Americans, reached about 14 before the U.S. actually negotiated and brought them back. One can argue that the data on this anecdotally shows that when we ignore it, when we pretend that it doesn't happen, when we don't negotiate over these things, the countries actually take more, so it makes Americans more vulnerable. Again, I believe the data shows that. Sorry?
Yeah, no, if I can answer, we now have a new data point. Show me a situation, show me an incident in the past where you take a person with this kind of record with this amount of blood on their hands. The Israelis do I understand they do negotiate with terrorists, and sometimes you scratch your head like, what are they thinking? The remains of a fallen soldier is not worth someone who's going to kill more people. That notwithstanding, we have a new data point where a person like this was traded for a person of celebrity status. Like I said, I'm happy she's home, but think about who is now loose. It's mind-boggling to me.
Guys, let's not forget what happened 2 years ago, guys, with Benjamin Netanyahu negotiating on behalf of Naama Issachar, the Israeli young woman. It was kind of a similar situation to Brittney Griner. She was also arrested for some minor drug charges in Russia. In that case, there was no prisoner swap, but there were major concessions that Netanyahu and Israel made towards Putin and Russia, giving back even some land in Jerusalem, and there was money issues there. There were major things, and then also Netanyahu flew all the way to Moscow to bring Naama Issachar back, and nobody knew who Naama. She's not a Brittney Griner. She's just a regular woman. Nobody knew who she was.
I was there on the plane from Washington D.C. to Moscow to get Naama Issachar back. I was part of Netanyahu's entourage back then. We're nearing the end of our discussion, gentlemen, and I do want to ask you a more philosophical question, if you will. Is it just a reminder to all of us that we're merely bargaining chips in potential, that human trade is alive and kicking, and that the governments, at the end of the day, are viewing human lives as a potential political bargaining chip? Yoav.
Yeah, no doubt. That's very, very sad to say, but we saw it with Russia on few occasions, with Naama Issachar, now with Brittney Griner, with the others. It doesn't only happen in Russia. Now, we hear a lot of cliches. We'll never negotiate with those people. We'll never negotiate with terrorists, but it happens all the time. It's very sad, but true.
Mr. Bergman, should the Americans be encouraged or discouraged by this deal?
I think they should be encouraged. Here's the thing: when there's a hostage taking, domestic hostage taking for ransom in the United States, the FBI steps in. The first task of the FBI is to help the family facilitate ransom payment to the capture in order to bring back the victim. Why? Because at 90% of the time, that helps get the victim back home safely. Once the victim is back home, does the FBI go home and pack their stuff? No. They go and they prosecute and they go after the people who have wronged the victim. That's where we're missing.
Mr. Katz, 7 seconds left, please.
This is not a good an analogy. In this case, the ransom involves the release of someone who's going to kill many, many people.